Welcome to Grim and Cozy Crafting, where true crime meets chill vibes. Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbing lists imaginable: 50 serial killers in 50 states. Every state in the U.S. has had at least one serial murderer lurking in its history, and tonight, we'll take a chilling tour across the country to uncover the most notorious killer from each state. So get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. Alabama. We start in Alabama with Daniel Lee Siebert. In the 1980s, Siebert went on a violent killing spree, targeting women and children. He was known for strangling and stabbing his victims, including a mother and her two sons. His reign of terror ended when authorities captured him, and he was sentenced to death in 1987, Alaska. Next, we venture into the frigid wilderness of Alaska, where Robert Hansen, aka the Butcher Baker, hunted his victims like prey. A respected baker by day, Hansen abducted women, flew them into the Alaskan wilderness, and set them loose, only to hunt them down with a rifle. He was eventually caught in 1983 and sentenced to over 400 years in prison. Arizona. Arizona's most notorious killer is Mark Goudeau, also known as the Baseline Killer. From 2005 to 2006, he terrorized Phoenix with a string of robberies, sexual assaults, and murders. He would disguise himself and attack victims at random, leaving the city in fear. After his arrest, DNA evidence linked him to 9 murders, and he was sentenced to death. Arkansas. Ronald Gene Simmons wasn't a traditional serial killer, but his crimes were no less horrifying. In 1987, over the span of a few days, Simmons executed 16 people, including 14 members of his own family, before going on a public shooting spree. His methodical and ruthless execution of his victims remains one of the deadliest family massacres in U.S. history. California. California is home to one of the most infamous serial killers of all time, Richard Ramirez, aka the Night Stalker. In the mid-1980s, Ramirez broke into homes, murdering and assaulting victims in their own beds. His crimes were particularly sadistic, and he showed no remorse. After his arrest in 1985, he was sentenced to death, though he died in prison before his execution. Colorado. Scott Lee Kimball was a con man, an FBI informant, and a serial killer. Between 2003 and 2004, he manipulated law enforcement while secretly murdering multiple people, including his girlfriend's daughter. His ability to deceive even the FBI makes his case uniquely disturbing. He is currently serving a 70-year sentence. Connecticut. William Devin Howell is Connecticut's most prolific serial killer. Between 2003 and 2004, Howell murdered at least 7 people and left their bodies in a wooded area behind a shopping center. He referred to his van as his murder mobile and later confessed that there were likely more victims. Delaware. Delaware's only known serial killer, Stephen Brian Pennell, is responsible for at least 5 brutal murders in the late 1980s. Pennell picked up women along highways, torturing and murdering them before leaving their bodies in remote locations. He was caught after authorities traced fibers from his van back to the crime scenes. He was executed in 1992. Florida. No serial killer list would be complete without mentioning Ted Bundy, and Florida was the final stop on his horrifying journey. In 1978, Bundy broke into a sorority house at Florida State University, murdering 2 women and attacking 2 others. Just weeks later, he kidnapped and killed 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Bundy was executed in 1989, and to this day, he remains one of the most infamous serial killers in history. Georgia. Wayne Williams is widely believed to be responsible for the Atlanta child murders, a series of over 20 killings that occurred between 1979 and 1981. While he was convicted for the murders of 2 adults, many believe he was also responsible for the deaths of multiple children. Despite the controversy surrounding his conviction, he remains in prison. Hawaii. Hawaii's most infamous serial killer is the Honolulu Strangler. This unidentified murderer killed 5 women between 1985 and 1986, strangling them and dumping their bodies near waterways. Despite an intense investigation, the killer was never caught, and the case remains one of Hawaii's greatest unsolved mysteries. Idaho. Joseph E. Duncan III was a predator with a long history of violent crimes. In 2005, he murdered a family in Idaho and kidnapped 2 children, keeping one of them captive for weeks before killing him. Duncan was later linked to other murders across the country. He was sentenced to death but died of cancer in 2021. Illinois. John Wayne Gacy, aka the Killer Clown, is one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. By day, he was a successful businessman and performed as a clown at children's parties, but at night he lured young men to his home, where he tortured and murdered them before burying their bodies in a crawlspace. He was executed in 1994, leaving behind a legacy of pure horror. Indiana. Herb Baumeister was a successful businessman with a dark secret. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, he lured young men to his mansion, where he killed them and buried their remains on his property. When authorities closed in, he fled to Canada and died by suicide before he could be arrested. His crimes left dozens of families without closure. Kansas. Dennis Rader, better known as the BTK Killer, tormented Wichita for decades. His name stands for bind, torture, kill, describing his gruesome modus operandi. He sent taunting letters to the media, evading capture until 2005, when he slipped up using a computer disk. Rader is now serving 10 life sentences. Kentucky. Donald Harvey, aka the Angel of Death, was a hospital worker who secretly poisoned patients, believing he was easing their suffering. However, he later admitted to enjoying the power of deciding who lived or died. He claimed to have killed over 80 people before his arrest. Roar, Louisiana. Derek Todd Lee stalked and murdered women in Baton Rouge in the 1990s and early 2000s. He was initially overlooked as a suspect because authorities believed the killer was white. DNA eventually linked him to multiple cases, leading to his arrest. He died in prison in 2016. Maine. John Joseph Joubert IV had a chilling double life, serving in the U.S. military while committing horrific crimes. Before joining the Air Force, Joubert kidnapped and murdered 2 boys in Nebraska. Investigators later linked him to a similar case in Maine. He was executed in 1996. Maryland. Joseph Roy Matheny was a grotesque blend of serial killer and cannibal. He lured victims under the guise of giving them food and shelter, then brutally murdered them. Even more disturbingly, he claimed to have ground up their flesh and mixed it with pork, serving it to unsuspecting customers at his roadside food stand. He died in prison in 2017, Massachusetts. The Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo, terrorized Massachusetts in the early 1960s, sexually assaulting and murdering 13 women. Though he confessed, doubts about his guilt persisted for decades. In 2013, DNA evidence finally confirmed his connection to the last victim, putting lingering skepticism to rest. Michigan. John Norman Collins, aka the Ypsilanti Ripper, was a charismatic college student hiding a monstrous secret. Between 1967 and 1969, Collins preyed on young women near Eastern Michigan University, sexually assaulting and murdering them. His good looks and charm allowed him to blend in until forensic evidence sealed his fate. He remains in prison in Minnesota. Paul Michael Stephanie, aka the Weepy-Voiced Killer, was known for his eerie, remorseful phone calls to police after each attack. From 1980 to 1982, he brutally attacked women in Minneapolis, then called authorities in a high-pitched crying voice, begging for help. His remorse didn't save him. He died in prison in 1998, Mississippi. Glenn Rogers, aka the Casanova Killer, was a drifter who charmed his way into women's lives before brutally murdering them. Though convicted of 5 killings in the 1990s, he claimed to have killed over 70. Some even speculate he was involved in the O.J. Simpson case, though no evidence supports this. He remains on death row. Missouri. Robert Berdella, aka the Kansas City Butcher, was a depraved torturer who held men captive in his home, subjecting them to unspeakable horrors before killing them. He meticulously documented his crimes in a journal, which led to his capture in 1988. He died in prison in 1992, Montana. Nathaniel Barjona was a convicted child predator who may have taken his crimes even further, into cannibalism. Authorities suspect he murdered a young boy in the 1990s and possibly served human flesh to unsuspecting guests at a barbecue. Though never convicted of murder, he died in prison in 2008. Nebraska. Charles Starkweather went on a killing spree in 1957 to 58, murdering 11 people alongside his teenage girlfriend, Carol Ann Fugate. Their crime spree terrified the Midwest, inspiring movies like Natural Born Killers. Starkweather was executed, while Fugate claimed she was forced to participate and was later released. Nevada. Stephen Paddock, responsible for the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history, is often debated in terms of classification. Was he a mass shooter or a serial killer? Regardless, his 2017 attack in Las Vegas, killing 60 and injuring hundreds, remains one of the most horrific acts of violence in modern times. New Hampshire. Terry Peter Rasmussen, also known as the Chameleon Killer, evaded authorities for decades by constantly changing identities. His crimes were linked to the Bear Brook murders, where he disposed of victims in barrels. DNA eventually revealed he had murdered his own girlfriend and her daughter. New Jersey. Richard Biegenwald, aka the Thrill Killer, had a history of violence dating back to his teenage years. Between 1958 and 1983, he murdered at least 6 people, though authorities suspect there were more victims. Biegenwald showed no remorse for his crimes and died in prison in 2008. New Mexico. David Parker Ray, aka the Toy Box Killer, is one of the most sadistic serial killers in U.S. history. He kidnapped and tortured women in a soundproof trailer he called his toy box, using elaborate methods of psychological and physical torment. Though suspected of murdering many, no bodies were ever found. He died in 2002 before serving his full sentence. New York. Joel Rifkin, one of New York's most infamous serial killers, confessed to killing 17 women in the 1990s. He was caught when police stopped him for a missing license plate, only to discover a decomposing body in his truck. Rifkin is serving a life sentence. North Carolina. Henry Louis Wallace, aka the Taco Bell Strangler, committed a series of brutal murders in Charlotte during the 1990s. He preyed on women he knew, including coworkers and friends, strangling them in their own homes. He was sentenced to death in 1997 and remains on death row. North Dakota. Eugene Butler may not be widely known, but he was North Dakota's first identified serial killer. In the early 1900s, authorities discovered the remains of 6 victims buried beneath his farmhouse. Given the time period, details of his crimes remain scarce, but he was later institutionalized for insanity. Ohio. Anthony Sowell, aka the Cleveland Strangler, preyed on women struggling with addiction. Between 2007 and 2009, he lured victims to his home, where he murdered and hid their bodies. His house was eventually raided, revealing the remains of 11 women. He was sentenced to death but died in 2021. Oklahoma. Nanny Doss, aka the Giggling Granny, poisoned multiple husbands, children, and relatives from the 1920s to the 1950s. She showed no remorse, often laughing about her crimes. She was finally caught after an autopsy revealed poison in one of her victims. She died in prison in 1965. Oregon. Dayton Leroy Rogers, aka the Malala Forest Killer, targeted women in the 1980s, torturing and killing them in secluded areas. He was known for his brutality, and his victims often suffered extreme violence before their deaths. Rogers was sentenced to death, where he remains today. Pennsylvania. Gary Heidnik was not just a serial killer. He was a depraved torturer who held women captive in his basement. He subjected them to unimaginable horrors, eventually killing 2 of his victims. Heidnik's crimes partially inspired the fictional character Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. He was executed in 1999. Rhode Island. Craig Price, aka the Warwick Slasher, was only 13 years old when he committed his first murder. By 15, he had brutally stabbed 4 people to death. His young age shocked the nation, and he was sentenced to prison, where he remains due to continued violent behavior. South Carolina. Todd Kohlhepp appeared to be a successful businessman, but he was hiding a dark secret. He murdered at least 7 people, including a mass shooting at a motorcycle shop. He was finally caught in 2016 when a kidnapped woman was found chained inside a storage container on his property. South Dakota. Robert Leroy Anderson was a rare type of serial killer, one whose primary motive was abduction. He kidnapped and murdered 2 women in the 1990s. Authorities believed he had other victims, but they were never found. He took his own life in prison in 2003, Tennessee. Paul Dennis Reed, aka the fast food killer, targeted restaurant employees in the late 1990s, murdering 7 people in a series of robberies. His cold and calculated nature made him a feared figure in Tennessee. He was sentenced to death but died in 2013. Texas. Dean Corll, aka the Candyman, orchestrated one of the most disturbing serial killing sprees in American history. With the help of 2 teenage accomplices, he kidnapped, tortured, and murdered at least 28 boys in the 1970s. His crimes were discovered when one of his accomplices shot him to death. Utah. Ted Bundy's killing spree spanned multiple states, but Utah was where he first started attracting police attention. Many of his victims were young college students who disappeared without a trace. Though he later escaped from prison in Colorado, his time in Utah played a crucial role in his eventual capture. Vermont. Israel Keyes was a meticulous and terrifying serial killer who operated across the country. Though arrested in Alaska, he admitted to multiple murders, including a suspected killing in Vermont. His method of hiding kill kits for future murders makes his true body count unknown. He died by suicide in 2012. Virginia. Timothy Spencer, aka the Southside Strangler, was the first killer in U.S. history to be convicted using DNA evidence. He terrorized women in the 1980s, breaking into their homes and brutally murdering them. His case marked a turning point in forensic science. He was executed in 1994. Washington. Gary Ridgway, aka the Green River Killer, is one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. He confessed to murdering at least 49 women over 2 decades, though the true number may be higher. Ridgway targeted vulnerable women and evaded capture for years until DNA evidence finally caught him. He is serving life in prison, West Virginia. Harry Powers, aka the Bluebeard of Quiet Dell, used newspaper ads to lure lonely women, promising love before brutally killing them. In the 1930s, authorities discovered his underground torture chamber, where he murdered multiple victims. His crimes shocked the nation, and he was executed in 1932, Wisconsin. Jeffrey Dahmer, aka the Milwaukee Cannibal, is one of the most infamous serial killers of all time. Between 1978 and 1991, he murdered 17 young men, engaging in gruesome acts of dismemberment and cannibalism. He was sentenced to life in prison, but was beaten to death by another inmate in 1994. Wyoming. Dale Wayne Eaton, aka the Great Basin Killer, is Wyoming's most notorious serial murderer. He abducted, assaulted, and murdered a woman in 1988, burying her in a makeshift grave. DNA evidence linked him to the crime years later, leading to his conviction and a death sentence. And that concludes our journey through 50 serial killers in 50 states. Some of these names are infamous, while others remain less known, but equally terrifying. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into true crime, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which cases you'd like to see next. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.